The blizzard had stopped 3 hours ago, which should have been Lysandra's first warning. True silence in the Frostlands never meant peace, it meant predators. And predators in these frozen northern territories always meant death. But Lysandra Sylvain was too tired to care. 21 days, 3 weeks of stumbling between wolf
Easy now,
packs
friend.
that barely
We'll get through
tolerated
this.
her presence long enough
Come on,
to
let's
accept her
move.
healing services before showing her the road again. 3 weeks of sleeping under snow-heavy pines with nothing but her grandmother's threadbare cloak and the phantom ache of a severed mate bond keeping her company. 3 weeks since Dorian Ashcroft stood before his entire pack and declared that the moon goddess herself had made a mistake. Her silver-white hair hung in frozen ropes past her shoulders, the unusual platinum color that had once been called beautiful, now marking her as cursed. Her skin, pale as fresh snow even in summer, had taken on a grayish cast from exposure and exhaustion, and her eyes, those frost-blue eyes that her grandmother swore could see into souls, now only reflected the emptiness of someone who had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. She should have stopped hours ago, should have found shelter before sunset when the temperature dropped from merely dangerous to absolutely lethal. But the nearest pack settlement was still a full day's walk, and besides, sleeping alone in the wilderness had never frightened her before, not when she had nothing left to lose. The sound shattered the deathly quiet like thunder splitting stone. A growl, deep, guttural, edged with agony. Not the sound of a normal wolf, but something much larger, much more powerful. Something dying. Lysandra froze, every survival instinct screaming at her to turn around and run. Sounds like that in the Frostlands meant apex predators, territorial alphas, or worse, injured rogues desperate and dangerous enough to attack anything that moved. An injured predator was the most dangerous thing in the wilderness. But the sound came again, weaker this time. Raw desperation replacing fury, the kind of sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the healer's soul she'd spent 24 years cultivating. It was the sound of something fighting not to die, fighting to hold on, losing the battle anyway. Her feet were moving before her mind could talk her out of it, crunching through knee-deep snow toward a shadowed outcropping of ice-covered rock. Her healing sense, that magical awareness her grandmother had spent 18 years teaching her to hone, suddenly flared to life like a beacon in the darkness. Pain. Overwhelming, agonizing pain, and beneath that something else. Power. Ancient, primal power that made her wolf instincts whimper in terrified recognition, even as her healer's training pushed her forward. Lysandra rounded a jagged ice formation and stopped dead. There, collapsed in the mouth of a shallow cave, was the largest wolf she had ever seen. His fur was black as a moonless midnight, frosted with ice and matted with blood that steamed in the frigid air. Deep claw marks scored his massive ribcage, revealing muscle and bone beneath. Silver-tipped bite wounds punctured his throat and shoulders, the signature mark of assassins who hunted royalty. And his eyes, those burning amber eyes that locked onto hers with startling intelligence and something that looked almost like desperate hope, were fading. The light was dying as she watched. This was no rogue. This was an alpha, a powerful one. And he was bleeding out right in front of her. Lysandra's hands trembled as she took a step closer. Her breath formed clouds in the freezing air. Every rational part of her brain screamed to run. This was exactly how rejected mates died in the Frostlands, alone and foolish, trying to help creatures that would tear them apart without a second thought. But her healer's sense was overwhelming now, cataloging injuries faster than she could process them. Deep lacerations across the ribcage, puncture wounds along the throat and shoulders, and that sickly gray shimmer beneath his skin, spreading through his veins like rot. Silver poisoning. Only assassins use silver-tipped weapons. Only someone hunting royalty or high-ranking alphas would dare use something so forbidden, so explicitly designed to kill wolves slowly and painfully. The massive wolf's chest heaved with labored breaths, each one weaker than the last. Blood pooled beneath him on the ice-covered stone, turning pristine white crimson. He should have been unconscious by now. Should have been dead, honestly, with injuries this severe. But those amber eyes never left her face, tracking her every movement with an awareness that made her skin prickle. He was watching her, waiting. "Easy," Lysandra whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the wolf or herself. She took another step forward, then another. Her boots slipped slightly on blood-slicked ice. "I'm a healer. I'm not going to hurt you." The wolf made a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a whine. His massive head dropped to the ground, as if even holding it up required more strength than he possessed. The gesture was oddly vulnerable, almost trusting, and something in Lysandra's chest cracked wide open. To her knees beside him. Hissing as frozen to her knees beside him, hissing as frozen ground bit through her worn travel clothes. Up close, he was even more massive than she'd realized. His paws were the size of dinner plates, his body easily twice the size of a normal alpha wolf. And his fur, where it wasn't matted with blood, was glossy black and thick enough to survive the worst northern winters. This wasn't just any alpha. This was someone important, someone powerful. "Who did this to you?" she murmured, already reaching for her healer's pack with numb fingers. But even as she pulled out bandages and vials of basic healing salves, her heart sank. These injuries were beyond her supplies, beyond anything short of multiple trained healers working together for hours. The silver poisoning alone would kill him within minutes if she didn't act. The wolf's breathing hitched, stopped altogether. His amber eyes rolled back, and Lysandra felt his life force begin to slip away like water through her fingers. No, not again. She wouldn't watch another being die when she had the power to help. Her hands pressed against his blood-soaked fur, and she closed her eyes, reaching deep inside herself for something she'd sworn never to use again. 3 weeks ago. 21 days that felt like 21 years. The memory slammed into Lysandra with physical force, dragging her backward through time, even as her hands glowed with the first flickers of healing light. The Ashcroft Pack's ceremonial grounds had been decorated with winter roses, their white petals stark against dark wooden posts. 200 wolves gathered in concentric circles, their breath forming clouds in the cold evening air. At the center stood Dorian Ashcroft, 27 years old and golden-haired, the kind of alpha who looked like he'd been carved from sunlight and arrogance. And kneeling before him, silver hair braided with the traditional mating ribbons, was Lysandra. The mate bond had snapped into place 6 months prior, sudden and overwhelming and absolutely certain. The moon goddess's will, undeniable and sacred. Dorian had seemed pleased at first, had courted her properly with flowers and poetry and promises of a future where her unusual appearance would be celebrated, not scorned. She'd been foolish enough to believe him. "Lysandra Sylvain," Dorian's voice had carried across the silent crowd. Formal and cold, nothing like the warm whispers he'd shared with her in private. The change should have warned her, but she'd been too lost in the joy of finally belonging somewhere to notice the ice creeping into his tone. The moon goddess, in her infinite wisdom, creates bonds between souls meant to complete each other. Lysandra had smiled, her heart full to bursting. But even the goddess can make mistakes. The smile had frozen on her face. "Your appearance," Dorian continued, and his lip curled with disgust she'd never seen before, "marks you as cursed. Hair like a corpse, skin like death itself, eyes that promise winter's killing frost. You are an omen of misfortune, a walking warning that should never have been by to an alpha of my standing." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lysandra's breath caught in her throat, disbelief warring with dawning horror. "Dorian Ashcroft, alpha of the Ashcroft Pack, hereby reject you as my mate. I sever this bond before witnesses. You are cast out, unwanted, broken." The ceremonial knife had glinted in torchlight as he raised it, the blade designed to cut magical bonds, not flesh, but it might as well have been steel for how deeply it carved into Lysandra's soul. Pain, blinding, absolute pain as the mate bond was severed, torn from her heart like roots ripped from frozen ground. She'd collapsed forward under her hands, trying desperately not to scream, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her shattered completely. "You will leave Pack lands immediately," Dorian's voice had continued from somewhere above her, pitiless and final. "Consider the healer's kit a mercy, more than cursed creatures deserve." Someone had thrown her grandmother's old traveling bag at her feet. The crowd had parted like water, creating a path to the border. Not a single wolf had met her eyes. Not one had protested or questioned or offered comfort. They'd simply watched as she gathered her bag with shaking hands and walked away from the only home she'd ever known, her chest gaping open with a wound that would never fully heal. The broken bond had left a scar, invisible but undeniable, right over her heart. A jagged tear in her very soul that marked her as rejected, as someone even fate itself had found unworthy. And for 3 weeks she'd wandered the Frostlands, that scar aching with every step, every breath, every moment of existing in a world that had made it abundantly clear she didn't belong. Present moment. Frozen cave. Dying wolf. Lysandra's eyes snapped open, golden light already spilling from her hands. 3 weeks ago, Dorian had told her she was worthless, defective, a mistake the moon goddess had made. Tonight she would prove that even mistakes could have value. Her healing magic flared to life beneath her palms, warm energy spreading through her fingers as she tried to assess the damage. But the moment her power touched the silver poisoning, it recoiled like she'd been burned. Silver didn't just wound, it actively fought against healing magic, repelled it, turned it back on the caster. She could feel the poison spreading through the wolf's veins like black ice, shutting down his organs one by one. His heart was already struggling, beating erratically. His lungs were filling way with fluid. He had minutes, maybe less. Lysandra's own strength was nearly depleted. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time in over a week. The broken mate bond drained her constantly, leeching away her energy like an open wound that refused to close. Using her healing magic in this state was dangerous. Pushing beyond her normal limits could kill her. She should leave, should preserve what little strength she had and keep moving. No one would blame a rejected Omega for not sacrificing herself for a stranger, especially not an Alpha who probably wouldn't spare her a second glance if their positions were reversed. But those amber eyes, even as they dimmed, even as death crept closer, held no judgment. No disgust, just desperate, fading hope that anyone might care enough to try. Her grandmother's voice whispered through memory, soft and certain. A true healer doesn't choose who deserves to live, child. We choose to honor all life, even when it costs us everything. Lysandra took a shaking breath and made her choice. She pressed both hands firmly against the wolf's chest, feeling his heartbeat stutter beneath her touch. Then she reached past her normal healing reserves, past the safe limits her teachers had drilled into her, down into the deepest well of power she possessed, the place she'd been forbidden to touch, the place where healing magic became something else entirely. Life Weaver. The power exploded through her like lightning, white-hot and agonizing. This wasn't the gentle warmth of normal healing. This was raw, primal energy, the very essence of life itself, stripped of all safety and control. It felt like her veins were filled with molten gold, like every nerve ending was on fire. Lysandra screamed, but she didn't let go. She could feel it now, the connection forming between her life force and his, could feel her own vitality pouring into him like water into a shattered vessel, filling the cracks, sealing the breaks, forcing life back into dying tissue. The silver poisoning shuddered under the assault of pure life energy, burning away like frost under sunlight. His wounds began to close, flesh knitting back together with unnatural speed. His heartbeat strengthened, steadied, and hers began to falter. The world tilted. Lysandra's vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges. She could feel herself dying, feel her own life draining away to fuel his survival. But she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Not until he was safe, just a little more. Blood ran from her nose in hot streams, freezing instantly on her lips. Her hands trembled violently against his fur, golden light flickering like a candle in wind. The pain was beyond anything she'd ever imagined, beyond anything her grandmother's warnings had prepared her for. It felt like her soul was being torn apart thread by thread, unraveled and rewoven into someone else's tapestry. Lifeweaver didn't just transfer energy. It transferred life itself, the fundamental spark that separated the living from the dead. And she was giving all of it away. Through the haze of agony, she could feel the transformation happening beneath her hands. The silver poisoning that had been spreading like poison ivy through the wolf system was dissolving completely. Burning away under the onslaught of pure vitality she was pouring into him. The deep claw marks across his ribs were closing, muscle and tissue regenerating at impossible speed. The puncture wounds at his throat sealed themselves, new fur already beginning to sprout over pink, healthy skin. His heartbeat, that stuttering, dying rhythm, grew stronger with each passing second, pounding with renewed vigor. And with each of his heartbeats that strengthened, hers grew weaker. Lysandra could feel her own life force depleting like sand through an hourglass. Her heart was struggling now, skipping beats, forgetting its rhythm. Her lungs burned with each shallow breath, barely managing to pull in air. The cold that had been biting at her extremities was creeping inward, claiming her core, turning her blood to ice. She was dying. She knew she was dying, but she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. She didn't know who this wolf was, didn't know his name, his pack. Whether he was kind or cruel, loved or feared, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was a living being who deserved a chance to keep living. Someone's son, maybe someone's father. Someone who mattered to people who would grieve if he died here in this frozen cave. At least one of them should matter to someone. Her vision was failing now, the world fading to gray around the edges. Her hands were going numb, losing their grip on his fur. She tried to hold on, tried to give just a little more, make sure the healing was complete. But her body wasn't obeying anymore. Her fingers slipped from his coat. Her arms gave out. Lysandra collapsed forward onto the wolf's massive side, her cheek pressing against fur that was now warm and alive instead of cold and dying. Her silver-white hair spilled across his black coat like moonlight painting shadows. The contrast stark and beautiful in a way she couldn't see anymore. Everything was going dark, peaceful, quiet. "At least I mattered this time," she whispered, the words barely a breath. At least her last act had been saving a life instead of being discarded like trash. At least someone would live because she'd existed. That was more than Dorian had ever given her credit for. Her eyes closed, her heartbeat stuttered one final time, and then the wolf's eyes snapped open, blazing with amber fire. Power radiated from him in waves, primal and ancient, shaking the very foundations of the ice cave. His massive body shifted, muscles rippling with renewed strength. He lifted his head and looked down at the dying woman collapsed against his side, and the mate bond slammed into him like an avalanche. The wolf roared, the sound splitting the frozen air like thunder. His body began to shift, transformation rippling through him with desperate speed. Bones restructured, muscle reformed, fur receded into bronze skin. The process that usually took careful seconds felt like an eternity, while the woman, his mate, his God's damn true mate, lay dying against him. The bond was screaming through every fiber of his being, a golden thread connecting his soul to hers, and he could feel it fraying with each heartbeat she didn't take. Mine, true mate, dying. His wolf was roaring inside his mind, clawing at his consciousness with primal fury. She'd saved them, poured her own life into their dying body without hesitation, without knowing who they were, without asking for anything in return. And now she was paying the price for that selfless act. "No!" The word tore from his throat, fully human now, as he gathered her carefully into his arms. She was so light, so fragile, her skin cold as ice and pale as death. Her silver-white hair spilled over his arm like strands of starlight, and even half dead, even with blood frozen on her lips and her life force barely a flicker, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "No, you don't get to die, not now, not when I just found you." He could see the shimmer of life weaver magic still clinging to her skin, that ancient, forbidden power that had been lost for over 3 centuries. She was a life weaver, a true one, and she'd used that devastating gift to save a stranger bleeding out in a cave, not knowing she was saving Theron Nightshade, Alphaking of the Northern Territories. Theron staggered to his feet, his own legs still weak from the silver poisoning she'd purged from his system. His wounds were completely healed, not even scars remained, but hers were multiplying by the second. He could feel her slipping away through the bond, feel death's grip tightening around her spirit. "Guards!" he roared, his alpha command splitting the frozen air like a physical force. "To me, now!" The response was immediate. Wolves burst from the tree line where they'd been concealed, his elite royal guard emerging from hiding positions with weapons drawn and eyes wild. They'd been searching for him for weeks, ever since he'd escaped his captors and disappeared into the Frostlands. They'd been tracking his scent, following the trail of blood and silver poison, praying they'd find him alive. They hadn't expected this, and running behind the warriors, small legs pumping with desperate effort, came a child. "Papa!" Cassian's voice cracked with relief and tears, high and pure in the frozen air. The 5-year-old prince had been silent for 2 years, struck mute by the trauma of watching his father dragged away by assassins, of living every day not knowing if he'd ever see him again. But tonight he found his voice. "Papa, you're alive. I thought the bad wolves killed you. I thought you were gone like Mama." "I'm fine, Cassian." Theron's voice was rough, edged with barely controlled panic. He dropped to his knees, unable to stand any longer while holding his dying mate. "But she's not. She saved me. Healer. I need a healer now." The head of his royal medical team pushed through the crowd of guards, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and hands that glowed with immediate healing power. Octavia took one look at the woman in Theron's arms, at the shimmer of golden light still fading from her skin, and went pale. "Your Majesty, that shimmer, that's Life Weaver magic." "I know what it is," Theron snarled, alpha power rolling over the entire clearing like a physical force. "Can you save her?" Octavia dropped beside them, her hands already pressing against the woman's chest, healing magic pouring through her fingers. But even as she worked, her expression grew more dire. She's given too much. Her life force is nearly depleted. The broken mate bond on her heart is draining what little remains, and Octavia's eyes widened as her power encountered something else. Your Majesty, she bears the mark of a recent rejection. Someone severed her bond within the last month. The rage that exploded through Theron was primal and absolute. His wolf howled for blood, for vengeance, for the throat of whoever had dared to reject their mate. Power radiated from him in waves, making the snow around them melt and nearby trees groan under the pressure. Someone had looked at this woman, this brave, selfless, extraordinary woman who just saved the life of the Alpha King without hesitation, and decided she wasn't worthy. Had severed the sacred bond the moon goddess herself had created. Who? Theron's voice was barely recognizable, more growl than speech. Who did this to her? I don't know, Your Majesty. Octavia's hands were shaking as she continued working, pulling out vials of rare medicines from her kit. But rejection trauma is devastating, especially for the one who's cast aside. It damages the soul on a fundamental level, combined with life weaver depletion. She met his eyes and Theron saw genuine fear there. She shouldn't be alive right now. The combination of a broken bond and giving away her entire life force should have killed her instantly. The fact that she's still breathing is a miracle. Then perform another miracle, Theron commanded, his voice deadly soft. Save her. That's an order. Octavia nodded and turned back to her patient, calling for the other healers in their traveling party. 3 more rushed forward, their combined power creating a dome of shimmering light around the dying woman. Theron watched with his heart in his throat, still kneeling in the snow, unable to move away from her. Through the mate bond, he could feel her slipping further away with each passing second, the golden thread connecting them growing thinner and more fragile. Small hands tugged at his arm. Papa? Cassian's voice was tiny, frightened in a way it hadn't been since the night of the assassination attempt. Is the pretty lady going to die? Theron looked down at his son, at those wide amber eyes that were identical to his own, and felt something break inside his chest. After 2 years of silence, after 24 months of his boy refusing to speak, too traumatized by violence and loss to find his voice, Cassian had finally spoken. And it was to ask if another person he cared about was going to die. No, Theron said with absolute certainty, pulling Cassian close with one arm while keeping his other hand near the woman's pulse point. No, she's not going to die. The healers will save her. They have to, because the mate bond wouldn't have formed if she was meant to die. The moon goddess didn't make mistakes, no matter what some bastard had told her. The healers worked in frantic synchronization, their hands glowing with different shades of healing light as they poured everything they had into stabilizing the dying woman. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Theron counted each of her heartbeats, monitoring the bond, willing her to hold on. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Octavia sat back with sweat beading on her forehead despite the freezing temperature. She's stable, the head healer announced, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Barely. Her life force is critically low, and the broken bond is still draining her, but we've stopped the immediate decline. She'll need constant monitoring. Round-the-clock care. The next 5 days are critical. Octavia met Theron's eyes. If she wakes, she'll survive. If she doesn't, she'll wake, Theron said with absolute conviction. They transported her to the camp his guards had established while searching for him, a temporary stronghold built around ancient standing stones that provided some shelter from the elements. Theron had her placed in his own tent, on his own furs, and refused to leave her side. His hand stayed near her pulse point, feeling each fragile heartbeat, monitoring the bond that grew incrementally stronger with each hour that passed. Cassian curled up beside her on the second night, his small hand clutching hers. Please wake up, the boy whispered, words flowing freely now in a way they hadn't for 2 years. Please don't leave. Papa needs you. I need you. We've been alone for so long, and you made the hurt stop, and I don't want to be alone again. Theron closed his eyes, listening to his son's broken prayers, and added his own silent plea to the moon goddess. Let her live. Let her stay. Let us have this chance. On the 7th day, as dawn broke golden and clean across the frozen landscape, Lysandra Sylvain's frost-blue eyes finally opened, and the first thing she saw was amber eyes watching her with infinite patience and desperate hope, waiting for her to come back to life. Lysandra's first conscious thought was that dying felt surprisingly comfortable. The surface beneath her was too soft to be snow, too warm to be stone. Silk sheets whispered against her skin instead of frozen leather. The air smelled of cedarwood and winter roses instead of blood and ice. Wherever death had taken her, it was far gentler than the stories had promised. Her eyes fluttered open to golden light filtering through crystalline windows. The ceiling above her was vaulted and magnificent, carved from pale wood inlaid with silver that caught the morning sun like captured starlight. Rich tapestries depicting wolves running beneath full moons hung on walls that stretched impossibly high. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in, filling the space with warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. This wasn't a healing tent. This was a palace chamber. Panic seized her chest, sharp and immediate. Where was she? How long had she been unconscious? The last thing she remembered was collapsing against black fur, feeling her heartbeat fade, accepting that she was going to die alone in that frozen cave, saving a stranger who would never know her name. She'd made peace with it. So why was she waking up in a room that probably cost more than her entire village's yearly income? Easy. The voice was deep and commanding, but somehow gentle at the same time, a contradiction that made her head snap toward the sound despite her body's protests. A man sat in a chair beside her bed, and Lysandra's breath caught. He was tall, even seated, powerfully built with broad shoulders that spoke of a warrior's training and hands that looked like they could snap iron without effort. His hair was black with silver, streaking through it like lightning through storm clouds. Pulled back from a face that was all sharp angles and fierce beauty, a scar ran down his left cheek, pale against bronze skin. And his eyes, those burning amber eyes she'd seen fading in that cave, now blazing with life and an intensity that made her want to shrink into the mattress. You, she breathed, the wolf, the dying alpha. A slight smile curved his lips, though worry shadowed his expression. Me. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and Lysandra caught the scent of pine and snow and something wild that made her wolf instincts whimper in confused recognition. I'm Theron Nightshade, he said quietly, Alphaking of the Northern Territories. He paused, weighing his next words carefully. And you, Lysandra Sylvain, are my true mate. The world tilted sideways. No, impossible. She pushed herself upright despite her body's violent protests, silver hair spilling around her shoulders in tangled waves. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her chest, feeling for the familiar ache of the broken bond. It was still there, still raw, still bleeding spiritual energy into the void. I can't be. I'm broken. Defective. The words spilled from her lips like poison she'd swallowed and couldn't keep down. Dorian's voice echoed in her memory, cruel and absolute. The moon goddess already made a mistake with me once. I was rejected. The bond was severed. There can't be another. The bond was never a mistake. Theron's voice held absolute certainty, the kind of conviction that came from lived experience rather than blind faith. That bastard who rejected you was the mistake. He stood, moving closer, and the mate bond between them hummed to life like a plucked string. You saved my life with a power that's been lost for 3 centuries. You gave everything you had, expected nothing in return, and nearly died for a stranger. His hand reached out, stopping just short of touching her face, asking permission without words. You're not broken, Lysandra. You're extraordinary. She was shaking her head before he finished speaking, scrambling backward on the bed. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, impossible, another cruel trick that would end with her heart shattered on stones. Please, I need to leave. This isn't real. It can't be. Her feet hit the floor and her legs immediately buckled. 21 days of malnourishment, a broken mate bond, and life weaver depletion had left her body a fragile shell, held together by stubborn will, and nothing more. She would have hit the stone floor face first if Theron hadn't moved with inhuman speed, catching her before she fell. Let me go, Lysandra gasped, even as her traitorous body recognized his touch. The mate bond flared between them like a golden thread, pulling taut, warm and right in a way that terrified her more than any amount of rejection ever could. Please, I can't do this. I can't go through losing another bond. I can't. The door burst open with a bang that made them both start. A small boy with wild dark hair and enormous amber eyes charged into the room like a tiny hurricane. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, all gangly limbs and desperate energy contained in a too small body. Is she awake, Papa? Is she? The child's eyes landed on Lysandra, and his entire face transformed with joy so pure it hurt to witness. Before Theron could stop him, before Lysandra could protest, the boy launched himself at her, small arms wrapping around her waist in a fierce hug that nearly knocked her over again. You saved my Papa! His voice was muffled against her stomach. thick with emotion that shouldn't have been possible in someone so young. The bad wolves hurt him so much, and he was bleeding, and he couldn't breathe, and I was so scared he was going to die, like Mama did. But you made the hurting stop. You made him better. Lysandra stood frozen, Theron's steadying hand still on her shoulder, this small child clinging to her like she was something precious instead of a rejected failure. The boy tilted his head back, tears streaming down his round cheeks, and smiled at her with such genuine affection that something inside her chest cracked wide open. "Thank you," he whispered, voice breaking. "Thank you for saving my papa. I thought I was going to be alone forever." And Lysandra, who had spent 3 weeks believing she was worthless and unlovable and broken beyond repair, felt the first fragile seed of hope take root in her devastated heart. The days that followed existed in a strange, suspended reality. Theron had given her a suite of rooms in the palace's east wing, far enough from the royal quarters to feel respectful, close enough that the mate bond hummed contentedly between them like a second heartbeat. He never pushed, never demanded acknowledgement of what stretched between them, simply existed in her orbit with the patient inevitability of changing seasons, waiting for her to come to terms with impossible truths. His son had no such patience. Day 8 dawned clear and cold, winter sunlight streaming through windows. Lysandra still couldn't quite believe belonged to her temporary chambers. She was still in bed, wrapped in blankets softer than anything she'd ever touched, when a knock sounded at her door. Not Theron's firm, measured knock. This was enthusiastic and chaotic. The kind of knocking that suggested the person on the other side might break through the wood with sheer excitement if she didn't answer quickly enough. Lysandra pulled on the robe someone had left folded at the foot of her bed, simple blue wool that still felt luxurious compared to her travel-worn clothes, and opened the door. Cassian stood in the hallway holding a fistful of frost flowers, their white petals already wilting from the warmth of his small hands. His amber eyes were bright with hope and something that looked almost like nervousness. "I picked these for you," he announced, thrusting the flowers forward. "From the gardens. Papa says it's polite to bring gifts when you visit someone who's been sick." Lysandra's throat tightened. When was the last time someone had brought her flowers? "They're beautiful," she managed, taking them carefully. "Thank you, Cassian." His face split into a grin that could have lit the entire palace. "Can I come in? I want to show you around. You've been sleeping for so long, and there's so much to see, and the kitchens have the best cook, and she makes these little cakes with honey and—" "Cassian." Theron's voice came from further down the hall, warm with amusement. "Let her breathe, son." The king approached, and Lysandra was struck again by his sheer presence. He'd been in travel clothes when she first saw him, practical leather and fur. Now he wore the formal attire of the station, deep blue and silver, that made his amber eyes seem to glow. "You don't have to entertain him if you need more rest," Theron said gently. But Cassian was already tugging at her hand, bouncing on his toes. "Please? I've been waiting for days and days, and Papa said I couldn't visit until you were better. But you're better now, right? You're awake and everything." Lysandra looked down at the child's eager face, at the hope written so plainly across his features, and found she couldn't refuse. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. "A tour sounds wonderful." Cassian's whoop of joy echoed down the corridor. The palace was magnificent in ways Lysandra had never imagined. She'd grown up in a small healing cottage on the edge of Packlands, her world bounded by forest and necessity. The grandeur of the royal residence was overwhelming, all soaring ceilings and intricate stonework and windows that transformed sunlight into rainbows. But what struck her most wasn't the architecture. It was how Cassian knew every corner, every secret passage, every servant by name. "That's Master Willem," the boy whispered conspiratorially as they passed an elderly wolf arranging flowers in a hallway vase. "He's been here since Papa was little. He tells the best stories about when Papa was my age and tried to shift for the first time and got stuck halfway and had to hop around on 2 legs and 2 paws for an hour." Lysandra bit back a smile, glancing at Theron, who had the grace to look embarrassed. "We don't need to share all my childhood mishaps," the king muttered. "And that's Lady Mira," Cassian continued, pointing to a stern-looking woman overseeing a group of younger wolves polishing armor. "She's the weapons master. She taught Papa how to fight. She's really scary, but she always saves me the first strawberries from the greenhouse in summer." On and on it went, through grand halls and quiet corners, Cassian's running commentary revealing a palace that wasn't just a seat of power, but a home, a community. Every person they passed greeted the young prince with genuine warmth, and many of them looked at Lysandra with curiosity rather than the suspicion she'd grown accustomed to. They ended up in the kitchens, A massive space filled with copper pots and the smell of baking bread. A woman with flour-dusted hands and laugh lines around her eyes looked up from kneading dough and immediately smiled. Young Cassian, I should have known that ruckus was you. Mistress Alara, this is Lysandra. She saved Papa. Can we have some of the honey cakes, please? The cook's expression softened as she looked at Lysandra, something like understanding in her eyes. The healer who brought our king home, she said quietly. You have our gratitude, dear girl. And yes, of course you can have honey cakes. I'll make a fresh batch. As they waited, Cassian climbed onto a stool beside the work counter, swinging his legs. Do you know how to bake? He asked Lysandra suddenly. A little. My grandmother taught me some recipes. Can you teach me? Lysandra hesitated, glancing at Theron, who leaned against the doorframe, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. If your father doesn't mind. I don't mind, Theron said softly. And that was how Lysandra found herself flour-dusted and laughing in a palace kitchen, teaching a 5-year-old prince how to measure ingredients for rosemary honey cakes, while the Alphaking watched with something that looked dangerously close to contentment on his scarred face. For the first time in 3 weeks, the broken bond in her chest didn't ache quite so sharply. The pattern continued over the next 6 days. Cassian appeared at her door every morning without fail, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with interesting rocks he'd found in the gardens. Once with a half-frozen frog he'd rescued from the fountain and insisted needed healing. They baked together, walked the gardens, read stories in the library, where Cassian would curl against her side like a puppy seeking warmth. Theron was always nearby, never intrusive but constant. Sometimes he joined them, his deep voice reading adventure tales that made Cassian's eyes go wide with wonder. Sometimes he simply watched from a distance, as if he couldn't quite believe they were real. Lysandra was beginning to understand the feeling. On day 14, as afternoon light slanted golden through the library windows, Cassian looked up from the story they were reading and asked the question she'd been dreading. Why did your old mate reject you? The book nearly slipped from her hands. Theron, who'd been reviewing correspondence in a nearby chair, went very still. Cassian, the king said quietly, that's a painful subject. But I want to understand. The boy's amber eyes were serious, far too old for his young face. Everyone here likes Lysandra. She's nice and she smells good and she makes the best cookies. Why wouldn't someone want her? Lysandra's throat tightened. How did you explain cruelty to a child who'd already witnessed too much of it? Sometimes, she said carefully, people are afraid of things they don't understand. My appearance, my silver hair and pale skin, it's unusual. And the alpha I was bonded to decided that unusual meant wrong. That's stupid, Cassian declared with the blunt honesty only children possessed. Different doesn't mean bad. Master Willem says the rarest flowers are the most beautiful. Something warm unfurled in Lysandra's chest. Your Master Willem sounds very wise. He is. Cassian snuggled closer against her side. I'm glad that mean alpha let you go, because if he hadn't, you wouldn't be here with us. Later, after Cassian had been taken off to bed by his nursemaid, Lysandra stood in the frost gardens watching snow fall in the moonlight. The broken bond ached as it always did, a constant reminder of rejection and failure. But beneath that pain, something new was growing. Not quite healing, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. He's right, you know. Theron's voice came from behind her, quiet in the snowfall. She hadn't heard him approach, but somehow his presence felt expected rather than intrusive. About what? She asked without turning. That bastard letting you go was the best thing that ever happened to my son. A pause. To me. Lysandra closed her eyes, feeling the mate bond stretch between them, golden and undeniable. I'm still broken, she whispered. The bond, the rejection, it left a scar that won't heal. I can feel it draining me every day. Then we'll find a way to heal it. Theron moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth but not touching. Together, if you'll let us. She looked up at him, at this powerful king who'd been nothing but patient and kind, and felt the fragile hope in her chest grow a little stronger. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. How to trust again. How to believe this is real. One day at a time, Theron said simply. No pressure, no expectations. Just stay. Let Cassian teach you the palace. Let Mistress Alara feed you until you've gained back the weight you lost. Let me, he paused, searching for words. Let me prove that not all alphas are blind fools. Despite everything, Lysandra felt a smile tug at her lips. One day at a time, she echoed. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't healing. But it was a start. Day 15 arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the Frostlands beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Lysandra had fallen into a routine now, her body slowly recovering from the Life Weaver depletion. Breakfast in her rooms, morning walk with Cassian, afternoons in the library, or helping Octavia organize the medical supplies. Evenings watching the sunset from the Frost Gardens. A peaceful existence that felt almost too good to be real. She should have known it wouldn't last. The screams shattered the midnight silence like breaking glass. Lysandra jolted awake, heart pounding, the sound of absolute terror echoing through the corridors. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure if the scream was real or part of a nightmare. Then it came again, closer, right outside her door. She threw off the blankets and ran to the entrance, yanking it open. Cassian was in the hallway, curled in a ball against the wall directly across from her rooms. His small body was shaking violently, hands clawing at the carpet as if trying to dig through stone. His eyes were open but unseeing, locked on some horror only he could witness. "No, no, Mama, the red water. Don't go under. Please don't." The words tumbled out in broken gasps between sobs. Lysandra dropped to her knees beside him, reaching out carefully. "Cassian, sweetheart, it's all right. You're safe." He flinched away from her touch, still trapped in whatever nightmare held him. "The red water, it's pulling her down. I can't reach her. Papa's screaming, but she won't come back." Ice flooded Lysandra's veins. Red water, childbirth. The boy had witnessed his mother die. He'd been only a newborn, and somehow the trauma had imprinted so deeply it haunted him still. Footsteps pounded down the corridor. Theron appeared, barefoot and shirtless, hair wild from sleep. His face went pale when he saw his son. "How long has he been like this?" "I just found him." Lysandra kept her voice calm despite the panic clawing at her throat. "He's reliving something. His mother's death, I think." Theron's jaw clenched, pain flashing across his face. "It happens sometimes. The nightmares. He hasn't had one in months. I thought maybe he was getting better." The red water won't stop. Mama's hair is floating, and her eyes are closed. Cassian's voice broke on a sob that shattered something in Lysandra's chest. This child had carried this trauma alone for 5 years, had locked it so deep inside that 2 years ago it stole his voice, his ability to speak, his capacity for normal childhood joy. And even now that he'd found his voice again, the nightmares remained, haunting him, drowning him in memory. Lysandra made a decision. "I can help him," she said quietly, meeting Theron's desperate gaze. "But I need to use Life Weaver magic. Not for healing, not the way I used it on you. Something different, something internal. Will it hurt him? No, but it will show him what he's too young to understand on his own. That the memory doesn't have to control him. That he can let it go." Theron searched her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it. Please." Lysandra gathered Cassian carefully into her arms. He fought at first, still lost in his nightmare, but she held him gently until his struggles weakened. "Cassian," she whispered against his hair. "Can you hear me? It's Lysandra. You're safe. You're in the palace with your papa and me. The red water isn't real. Not anymore." "But Mom, I know, sweetheart. I know. Do you trust me?" The boy's amber eyes focused on her face, recognition slowly filtering through terror. "Yes," he breathed. "Then I'm going to help you understand. This might feel strange, but I promise it won't hurt. All right?" A tiny nod against her shoulder. Lysandra pressed her hand over his racing heart and let just a whisper of Life Weaver magic flow through her palm. Not taking this time. Not giving exactly. Soothing. Guiding. Showing. The power worked with surgical precision, finding the knots of trauma lodged in Cassian's young spirit and gently, carefully untangling them. She couldn't erase the memory. That would be cruel and wrong. But she could show him that the memory was in the past. That what happened was real and terrible, but it was over. He was safe now. In his mind, she showed him a garden. His mother standing in sunlight, smiling and whole and free from pain. Not drowning in red water, but dancing in green grass, her hand extended toward him. "Mama says it's okay to miss her," Lysandra whispered, guiding the vision. "But she doesn't want you to be scared anymore. She wants you to remember the happy times. The times she held you and sang to you and loved you." Cassian's breathing began to steady, the violent shaking easing. "She's with the moon goddess now," Lysandra continued softly. "She's safe and happy and watching over you. And she sent someone to help take care of you. Someone who understands what it's like to lose people you love." The boy's eyes, still wet with tears, focused on her face. You, he whispered. Me, if you'll let me. A sob broke from his small chest, but this one was different. Not terror. Not the drowning horror of nightmare. Relief, release. The kind of crying that came when a wound finally drained. I thought the bad wolves killed Papa too, he choked out against her shoulder. I thought I was going to be alone forever. Like you were after your mate said those mean things and made you leave. Lysandra's own tears came then, hot and unexpected. You're not alone, Cassian. Neither of us is, not anymore. Promise? I promise, Merbuz. He clung to her like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world, his small body gradually relaxing as exhaustion overtook him. Within minutes, he'd fallen asleep in her arms, his breathing deep and even, and, for the first time in who knew how long, peaceful. Lysandra looked up and found Theron watching them from where he'd remained standing in the hallway. His amber eyes were wet, his expression raw with an emotion she couldn't name. Gratitude, wonder, something deeper that made her breath catch. Thank you, he said, voice rough. Thank you for giving me back my son. But Lysandra understood the truth even as she held Cassian's sleeping form, even as the mate bond between her and Theron pulsed with warmth and rightness. Cassian hadn't just been healing. She had too. This broken, rejected Omega who'd believed she was worthless had spent 2 weeks teaching a traumatized child that wounds could heal, that trust could be rebuilt, that family wasn't always the one you were born into. She'd been teaching herself the same lessons, and somewhere in the process of putting this little boy back together, she'd started putting herself back together too. Day 20 dawned with the kind of soft snowfall that made the world look new. Lysandra woke to find a note slipped under her door. Theron's precise handwriting, requesting her presence in the Frost Gardens after breakfast. Not a command, an invitation. She found him waiting among the winter roses, their white petals catching snowflakes like stars. He'd clearly put effort into his appearance. Formal jacket brushed clean, hair tied back neatly. But there was nervousness in the set of his shoulders that made him seem more human than king. Thank you for coming, he said as she approached. You've given me a home, saved my life. Let me bond with your son. How could I refuse? A slight smile crossed his face, but it faded quickly into something more serious. I wanted to talk to you, away from Cassian, away from the palace staff. Just us. Lysandra's pulse quickened, but she nodded. They walked in silence for a while, their footsteps crunching in fresh snow. The gardens were beautiful in winter, ice sculptures catching light and transforming it into rainbows, frost-covered trees creating corridors of crystalline beauty. Finally, Theron stopped beside a fountain frozen mid-flow, ice preserving the water in eternal cascade. I need to tell you about Isolde, he said quietly, about what happened 5 years ago. Lysandra wanted to tell him he didn't owe her explanations, but the words died in her throat. She'd shared her rejection with him, had let him witness her deepest shame. Perhaps he needed to share his grief in return. We were young when we bonded, Theron began, staring at the frozen fountain. 19 and 20. The mate bond was strong, real, everything it should be. We loved each other deeply. He paused, jaw working. Isolde got pregnant 2 years into our bond. We were overjoyed. Cassian was planned, wanted, a blessing we'd prayed for. The pregnancy was normal at first. Healthy? No complications. Snow fell around them, soft and silent. She went into labor on a winter night much like this one. I was with her the entire time, holding her hand. Everything seemed fine. Difficult, yes, birth is never easy, but fine. Theron's hands clenched at his sides. Then something went wrong. The bleeding wouldn't stop. The healers tried everything, every technique, every medicine, but the blood just kept coming. Red water, Cassian called it later. He was in the room. We didn't realize at the time that he was old enough to understand, to remember. Lysandra's heart broke for the small boy who'd witnessed such horror. Isolde died 3 hours after Cassian was born. She never got to hold him properly. Never got to see him open his eyes, just slipped away while I begged her to stay. A tear tracked down Theron's scarred cheek. I thought that was it. Thought the moon goddess had given me my one chance at love and I'd lost it. I wore that loss like armor for 2 years. Told myself I was done with fate's plans. He finally looked at Lysandra, amber eyes burning with intensity. Then 3 years ago, I started investigating Isolde's death more thoroughly. Something about it never sat right with me. Healthy women don't just bleed out like that. Not with our best healers attending. I went through her medical records, her treatment logs, everything. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I found evidence that someone had been slowly poisoning her. Nothing obvious, nothing that would show up in normal examinations. But there, in the records, if you knew what to look for, small doses of toxins over months, weakening her body, making sure that when the time came, she wouldn't survive childbirth. Horror flooded through Lysandra. Someone murdered her? Someone murdered the mother of the heir to the Northern Territories. Theron's words were edged with barely contained rage. And when I got closer to discovering who, I was ambushed, captured, held in a cell for 2 years while my son grew up without either parent. That's why you were in those caves, Lysandra breathed. You weren't just injured. You escaped. 3 weeks before you found me. I killed 6 guards, stole their weapons, and ran. They hunted me across the territories, finally caught up to me in that cave. I thought I was going to die there. Thought Cassian would be left truly alone. Theron reached up, cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted his warrior's hands. Then a silver-haired healer appeared out of nowhere and poured her entire life into saving a stranger. And the mate bond formed. Different this time. Stronger. And I understood. Understood what? Lysandra whispered. The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes, Lysandra. She makes corrections. Isolde and I were right for each other in that moment, for that time. She gave me Cassian, gave me the experience of love, but she wasn't my forever. His thumb traced her cheekbone, reverent and careful. You are. Lysandra felt tears spill over, running down her cheeks onto his hand. I'm still broken, she said, voice cracking. The bond, the rejection, is a scar. And scars prove we survived something that tried to destroy us. He pulled aside his collar, revealing a jagged mark over his heart that she'd noticed before, but never understood. This is where the bond broke when Isolde died. It nearly killed me. For 2 years, I believed I was fundamentally damaged. Wrong. Unworthy of a second chance. Theron met her eyes, his gaze fierce and tender all at once. But then you appeared, and the bond formed again. Different. Yours. And I finally understood that broken doesn't mean finished. It just means we're being remade into something stronger. Lysandra couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at this man who understood her pain because he'd lived through his own version of it. I'm offering you a choice, Theron continued, his voice rough with emotion. Stay here as Cassian's guardian, as my friend, with no expectations about the mate bond. Or, he paused, searching her face. Accept what's between us, not because fate demands it, but because you choose it freely, because you know your worth, regardless of what some bastard once said. The frost garden was silent except for falling snow and Lysandra's racing heartbeat. She thought about the last 3 weeks, the rejection, the wandering, the belief that she was worthless. Then she thought about the last 13 days. Cassian's laughter, Theron's patient kindness, the feeling of belonging she'd found in this palace, the way her broken pieces had started fitting back together. I choose. A door slammed open somewhere in the palace, cutting off her words. Octavia appeared at the garden entrance, her face pale and frightened in a way Lysandra had never seen. Your Majesty, the healer gasped, clearly having run the entire way. Your Majesty, you need to come quickly. I've found something. About Queen Isolde's death. Theron's entire body went rigid. What did you find? Octavia's hands shook as she held up a sheaf of old medical records. I was reorganizing the archives like you asked, going through every document from 5 years ago. And I found, she looked like she might be sick. The medical records were altered. Queen Isolde's official cause of death was listed as blood loss from childbirth complications. But I found the original autopsy report hidden in a misfiled folder. Your Majesty, she didn't die from blood loss. Theron took a step forward, power rolling off him in waves. How did she die? Octavia met his eyes and Lysandra saw genuine fear there. Nightshade poison, a massive dose, administered during labor. It caused the hemorrhaging, made it look like a natural complication, and the prescription authorizing the use of nightshade as a pain management tool. She held out the records with trembling hands. The signatures authorizing the drug are from palace physicians. People who are still here, still working, still walking these halls. The temperature in the garden seemed to drop 10 degrees as Theron's alpha power exploded outward. Who? His voice was barely human. Who signed those orders? Octavia's face crumpled. Multiple people, Your Majesty. A conspiracy, not a single assassin. But the head physician who administered the final dose, she could barely get the words out. The signature belongs to Elder Kalen Shadowmere. He's been on the medical council for 30 years. He's trusted, respected, beyond suspicion. Theron went absolutely still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Kalen Shadowmere ordered my mate's murder? Has been walking free in my palace for 5 years while my son grew up motherless? It appears so, Your Majesty. And if he's been here this whole time, Octavia's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. He might have been the one who arranged your capture. The one who tried to have you killed in that cave. Lysandra's blood turned to ice. The conspiracy wasn't over. The person who'd murdered the queen, who'd tried to kill Theron, who'd left Cassian traumatized and alone, was still here, still in the palace, still within striking distance of everyone she'd come to care about. Theron's amber eyes blazed with fury as he looked between Octavia and Lysandra, and when he spoke, his voice held the absolute authority of an Alpha King pushed too far. Summon the elite guard, lock down the palace. No one enters or leaves without my explicit permission. He turned to Lysandra, and despite his rage, his touch was gentle as he took her hand. I need to handle this, but Lysandra, please, don't leave. Don't let fear drive you away from what we're building here. She squeezed his hand, feeling the mate bond pulse between them. I'm not going anywhere, she said with quiet certainty. We face this together. Because somewhere in the Frost Gardens, between confessions of pain and promises of hope, Lysandra had made her choice. She was done running. It was time to fight for the family she was finding, even if it meant facing the darkness that had destroyed them once before. The palace transformed overnight into something resembling a fortress. Elite guards stationed at every entrance. Patrols doubled. Every member of the Elder Council summoned for emergency questioning. And in the center of it all, Theron moved with the cold precision of a king who'd finally identified his enemy. Lysandra watched from the shadows of the council chamber as he interrogated each elder in turn. Kalen Shadowmere sat among them, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and a face that radiated grandfatherly warmth. He looked concerned, appropriately shocked by the accusations, every inch the loyal advisor who'd served the crown for 3 decades. He was also, Lysandra's instincts screamed, absolutely guilty. She'd spent enough time reading people during her healing work to recognize a predator wearing sheep's clothing. The way Kalen's eyes tracked Theron's movements, calculating and cold despite his worried expression. The slight tension in his shoulders, ready to bolt. The too careful modulation of his voice. This was a man who'd spent years perfecting his mask, and it was starting to slip. Day 22 crawled past with no resolution. The medical records were damning, but Kalen claimed forgery, insisted he'd been set up by rivals. Without concrete proof, without witnesses willing to testify, Theron's hands were tied by the very laws designed to protect his subjects from tyranny. Even kings couldn't execute based on suspicion alone. Lysandra spent the day with Cassian, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the boy, while the palace buzzed with tension. They baked cookies in the kitchens, read stories in the library, played in the snow gardens. But the child was perceptive, picking up on the adult's stress. Is Papa angry? He asked as they built a snowman shaped like a wolf. He's trying to solve a very difficult problem, Lysandra said carefully. About Mama? She looked at him, surprised. Cassian's amber eyes were serious, far too knowing for a 5-year-old. I heard the guards talking, he explained. They said someone hurt Mama on purpose, made her go to the moon goddess before she was supposed to. Lysandra's heart clenched. How much did he understand? How much should she confirm? Yes, she said quietly, deciding honesty was better than comfortable lies. Your papa is trying to find out who hurt your mama, to make sure they can't hurt anyone else. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, packing snow with mittened hands. Will they try to hurt Papa again? Or you? The fear in his voice made her pull him close. Your papa is very strong, and he has lots of guards protecting him, protecting all of us. But you're strong too, right? You saved Papa when the bad wolves hurt him. You could save him again if you needed to? Lysandra pressed a kiss to his dark hair, making a promise she prayed she could keep. I would do anything to protect you and your papa. Anything. Day 25 brought an unexpected visitor. Lysandra was in the healing wing helping Octavia organize medical supplies when a commotion erupted at the palace gates. Shouting, guards mobilizing. Then Theron's voice, sharp with command. Let him in, under escort. I'll see him in the throne room. 20 minutes later, Lysandra found herself standing beside Theron's throne as Dorian Ashcroft was led in by 4 armed guards. Her former mate looked terrible, thinner than she remembered, dark circles under his eyes, his golden hair unkempt, His clothes were travel-worn, suggesting he'd ridden hard to get here. When his gaze found her, something that looked almost like relief crossed his face. "Thank the goddess you're alive," he breathed. "When I heard you'd saved the Alpha King, that you were here in the palace, I had to come. Had to make sure you were safe." "Safe from what?" Theron's voice was glacial. "From you?" Dorian flinched but held his ground. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Your Majesty. I'm here to help. Because the people who threatened me, who forced me to reject Lysandra, they're not done." He reached into his jacket slowly, mindful of the guards with weapons trained on him, and pulled out a folded letter. Theron gestured for a guard to bring it forward. The king read it, his expression darkening with each line. "Where did you get this?" "It was slipped under my door 3 nights ago." Dorian's hands shook slightly. "From someone calling themselves the Shadowborn Covenant. They threatened me once before, 2 months ago, right before I rejected Lysandra. Said if I didn't sever the bond with the Life Weaver, they'd slaughter every child in my pack. 200 innocents." Lysandra's stomach dropped. "So you chose them over me?" "I chose 200 children over one person, yes." Dorian met her eyes, and she saw genuine anguish there. "I know that doesn't excuse what I did. How I did it. The cruelty was my own cowardice, trying to convince myself I was right. But the rejection itself, I had no choice." "There's always a choice," Theron said coldly. "Not when you're responsible for lives that aren't your own." Dorian turned back to the king. "This new letter says the Covenant is planning something. Here, in this palace, within days. They mentioned the heir and completing what was started 5 years ago." Horror washed through Lysandra. Cassian. They were going to try to kill Cassian. Theron was on his feet in an instant, alpha power rolling through the throne room like a physical wave. "When?" "The letter didn't specify. Just before the new moon. That's in 6 days." Dorian swallowed hard. "Your Majesty, I know I have no right to ask for your trust, but my grandmother was a shadowmancer before she died. She taught me things about dark magic, blood curses, the kind of ancient evil that organizations like the Covenant use. If they're planning something, I might be able to help counter it." Theron stared at him for a long moment, then looked at Lysandra. "Your call. He's your former mate. If you want him thrown out, I'll do it gladly." Everyone in the throne room waited for her answer. Lysandra looked at Dorian, at the man who'd shattered her heart and destroyed her sense of worth, who'd called her cursed and cast her out, who'd chosen his pack over their bond, who'd also, she was beginning to understand, been caught in an impossible situation with no good options. "Let him stay," she said quietly. "If he can help protect Cassian, nothing else matters." Relief flooded Dorian's face. "Thank you, I swear I'll—" "Don't swear anything to me," Lysandra cut him off. "Swear it to that little boy whose mother was murdered. Swear it to the king who's been fighting to keep his people safe. They're the ones who matter now." Dorian bowed his head in acceptance. And despite everything, Lysandra felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding. The recognition that the world was more complicated than heroes and villains, that sometimes good people made terrible choices for reasons that made sense to them. It didn't erase the pain, but it made carrying it a little easier. Day 27 arrived with tension thick enough to choke on. The new moon was 4 days away. Kalen Shadowmere remained under house arrest in his quarters, proclaiming innocence while Theron's investigators dug deeper into decades-old records. Dorian worked with the royal mages, setting up wards and detection spells for dark magic, and Lysandra stayed close to Cassian, her healer senses on high alert for any threat. The pre-ceremony feast was meant to be a show of strength, a declaration that the royal family would not be intimidated, that life would continue despite threats. Every noble family in the Northern Territories had been invited, the great hall decorated with winter flowers and ice sculptures that caught torchlight like captured stars. Lysandra sat at the high table beside Theron, wearing a gown of silver silk that Mistress Alara had insisted she borrow. Cassian was on her other side, chattering excitedly about the musicians and the elaborate ice swan centerpiece. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect. Lysandra's healing sense prickled with unease as servants brought out the first course. She couldn't pinpoint the source, but something was wrong. The air tasted off, felt heavy with malice. "Papa, look at the pretty goblets." Cassian pointed at the ceremonial wine glasses, crystal etched with pack symbols. Theron reached for his, the one marked with the royal crest, and Lysandra's entire world narrowed to that single moment. The scent, bitter almonds beneath floral wine, so faint most wolves would miss it. Hemlock. "Don't drink it!" She lunged across Cassian, knocking the goblet from Theron's hand. crystal shattered on stone, red wine spreading like blood across white marble. The hall went silent. Theron stared at the spilled wine, then at her, comprehension dawning. "Cassian," Lysandra said, her voice shaking. "Come here, sweetheart." The boy climbed into her lap, confused by the sudden tension. "Why did you—" He stopped mid-sentence, small nose wrinkling. "The wine smells bad," Cassian whispered. Like Mama's room, like the red water room." Horror crashed through Lysandra. Hemlock had a distinctive scent. And Cassian, who'd been in the room when his mother died from nightshade poison, had learned to recognize the smell of toxins. His nightmares had been trying to warn him all along. Theron rose slowly, alpha power radiating outward in waves that made every wolf in the hall drop their eyes in submission. "Clear the hall. Guards, seal every exit. No one leaves until we determine who poisoned that wine." Chaos erupted as nobles tried to protest, tried to flee. The elite guard moved with practiced efficiency, corralling people into groups, confiscating goblets for testing. But Lysandra wasn't watching the hall. She was watching Cassian. The boy had gone very still in her arms, his amber eyes fixed on something across the room. Following his gaze, she saw Kalen Shadowmere attempting to slip toward a side door, his grandfatherly mask finally cracking into panic. "There," Cassian said, his voice ringing with eerie clarity. "The bad man. He made the wine smell like Mama's room." Every eye in the hall turned to Kalen. The elderly counselor froze, trapped like a deer before wolves. For a moment, Lysandra thought he might try to talk his way out of it, might maintain his innocence. Then his face twisted into something ugly and hateful. "You should have died in that cave, boy king," Kalen snarled at Theron. "Should have bled out like your pathetic mate. The Covenant has been working for decades to purge the weak from our bloodlines, and you and your abomination child are the worst of them." He pulled something from his robes, a crystal vial glowing with sickly green light. Dorian shouted a warning, but too late. Kalen smashed the vial on the ground, and the world exploded into chaos. Green light erupted outward in a shockwave, not physical force, but magical. It washed over the hall like poison, and everywhere it touched, wolves collapsed, screaming. Their life forces being drained, pulled toward a single point, toward Cassian. Lysandra felt it instantly, the dark magic wrapping around the boy in her arms like invisible chains. A blood curse, ancient and vicious, designed to use the life force of everyone in the hall to fuel a single deadly purpose: killing the heir. Cassian gasped, his small body going rigid. Black veins began spreading across his skin from his heart outward, the curse activating something that had been planted long ago. 5 years ago, when Kalen had overseen his birth. "No!" Lysandra's scream tore from her throat as she felt Cassian's life force being torn away. The curse was tied to his blood, to his very existence. It had been waiting dormant since the day he was born, waiting for activation. And now it was draining him, using the power of every wolf in the hall to fuel his death. Theron lunged for Kalen, but the old man was already collapsing, his body burning from the inside out. The curse consumed its caster as payment, ancient magic demanding equivalent sacrifice. "The Covenant will rise," Kalen gasped with his dying breath. "Morgath comes." Then he crumbled to ash, leaving only his robes behind. But the curse continued. Cassian's screams echoed through the hall as black veins spread across his face, his neck, consuming him from within. Lysandra tried to use her healing magic, tried to pour Life Weaver power into him, but the curse repelled it. This wasn't physical damage. This was soul magic, blood magic, the darkest kind. "Help him!" Theron's voice broke on desperate command. "Someone help him!" But the royal healers were down, drained by the curse's activation. The mages were unconscious. Even Octavia lay sprawled on the floor, her life force pulled thin. Only Lysandra remained standing, her Life Weaver gift protecting her from the worst of the drain. And Dorian. The former Alpha staggered to her side, his face pale but determined. "Soul binding, he gasped. "It's the only way. Link your life force permanently to his. The curse will redirect to you instead." "How?" "My grandmother taught me the ritual. But Lysandra, you need to understand. Soul binding is permanent, irreversible. If the curse kills you, you're gone. And even if you survive, your life will be tied to his forever. You'll feel his pain, his emotions until one of you dies." Lysandra looked down at Cassian, at this precious child she'd come to love as her own. His eyes were rolling back, black veins reaching his heart. He had minutes, maybe less. "Tell me what to do," she said. "Lysandra, no." Theron had reached them, his hands on her shoulders. You'll die. The curse is too strong. It'll kill you just like it's killing him. She met his amber eyes, saw the desperation there, the terror of losing another person he loved. Then I'll die as his mother, she said simply, not as some rejected failure, as someone who chose to save a child who needed her. Understanding and anguish warred on Theron's face. I can't lose you, not when I just found you. Lysandra reached up, touching his scarred cheek. You won't lose me. Trust me. Trust us. She turned to Dorian. The ritual. Now. What followed was the most painful 5 minutes of Lysandra's life. Dorian spoke words in an ancient language she didn't understand, his hands glowing with silver light as he guided her through the soul binding. She had to cut her palm, press it to Cassian's chest directly over his heart, and pour every ounce of her Lifeweaver power into creating a permanent connection. Not just healing, fusing, her soul twining with his, creating a bond even deeper than mate bonds, the kind of connection that made two lives into one shared existence. Pain exploded through her as the curse sensed the new connection and latched onto her instead. The black veins that had been consuming Cassian reversed direction, flowing from his body into hers. She felt the curse invade her system, cold and vicious and designed to kill. Lysandra screamed, but she didn't let go. Golden light and black shadow merged where their hands connected, swirling together in impossible patterns. The curse was redirecting, choosing the new target, abandoning the boy for the woman offering herself as sacrifice. Cassian's eyes cleared, his breathing steadied. The black veins faded from his skin, and Lysandra's heart stopped. She collapsed backward, the soul binding complete, the curse now fully transferred to her. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Theron's anguished roar and Cassian's terrified cry of "Mama." Then nothing. Death was cold and quiet and strangely peaceful. Lysandra drifted in darkness, aware but not present, existing in that liminal space between life and whatever came after. She could feel the curse eating at her soul, consuming the life force she'd already depleted, saving Theron weeks ago. She'd known this was likely when she made her choice, known she probably wouldn't survive. But Cassian would live, and that was enough. Warmth bloomed suddenly in the darkness. Not the cold comfort of acceptance, but searing, burning heat, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, like spring erupting through winter ice. The mate bond, Theron's presence slammed into her consciousness, his alpha power wrapping around her soul like armor. She felt him, distant but growing closer, refusing to let her go. And then another presence joined them, smaller, younger, filled with golden light that tasted like honey cakes and frost flowers, and the innocent joy of a child who'd found safety after terror. Cassian, the boy's Lifeweaver gift, dormant since birth, awakened by the trauma of nearly dying. His power reached through the soul binding they'd just created, finding her in the darkness and poured into her with desperate affection. Don't leave, Mama. Please don't leave. We need you. 3 souls connected in that moment. Alphaking, grounding and strengthening. Lifeweaver child, healing and nurturing. Lifeweaver healer, linking and binding. The Trinity bond. Power exploded through Lysandra like lightning striking water, 3 sources merging into something that had never existed before. Theron's alpha strength amplified her Lifeweaver magic. Her connection to Cassian created a circuit for his awakening power. The boy's innocent faith provided pure life energy untainted by trauma. Together, they burned brighter than any darkness could withstand. The curse that had been consuming Lysandra shuddered under the assault of combined power. It tried to adapt, tried to hold on, but it was designed to kill one person. Not 3 souls fused into unified purpose. The Trinity bond purged the curse like sunlight burning away shadow, dissolving it into nothing, leaving only pure life force flowing between them. Lysandra gasped, her heart restarting with a jolt that felt like being struck by lightning. Her eyes flew open. She was lying on the floor of the Great Hall, Theron kneeling over her with one hand pressed to her chest, his alpha power still pouring into her. Cassian was beside him, small hands glowing with golden Lifeweaver light, tears streaming down his face. You came back, the boy sobbed. You came back, Mama. And Lysandra realized with dawning wonder that she had. They'd saved each other, all 3 of them, pulling each other back from death through sheer stubborn love. She reached up with trembling hands, one for Theron, one for Cassian, and pulled them both close. I'm here, she whispered. I'm here, and I'm not leaving, not ever. The Trinity bond pulsed between them, visible now as threads of golden light connecting their hearts. Stronger than mate bonds, deeper than blood ties. family, forged in sacrifice and sealed in love. Dawn of the new moon arrived with impossible beauty. The palace still bore scars from the previous night's battle. Nobles were recovering from having their life forces drained. Healers worked overtime tending to the wounded. And in a heavily warded cell, investigations continued into Kaelin's co-conspirators, rooting out every member of the Shadowborn Covenant that had infiltrated the court. But the mating ceremony would proceed as planned. Theron had been adamant despite Lysandra's protests. After everything they'd survived, after nearly losing each other twice, he refused to wait another day to make their bond official. "We've earned this," he'd said, amber eyes fierce and tender. "The darkness tried to destroy us. Let's answer with light." So Lysandra found herself in a preparation chamber, being fussed over by Mistress Alara and a team of attendants who seemed determined to transform her into something worthy of a king. The gown they'd created was breathtaking, silver silk that shimmered like starlight, embroidered with winter roses in white thread. It made her pale skin glow instead of looking sickly, made her silver hair seem like spun moonlight instead of a corpse's warning. For the first time in her life, Lysandra looked at her reflection and saw beauty instead of curse. "You're ready," Mistress Alara said softly, touching her shoulder. The ceremony took place in the palace's great courtyard as the new moon rose, under an aurora borealis that danced across the sky in ribbons of green and gold. Hundreds of wolves gathered from across the northern territories. Nobles and commoners alike, all come to witness their king claim his mate. But what made Lysandra's breath catch was the ring of wild northern wolves surrounding the courtyard. Massive creatures who'd emerged from the forest to bear witness. They'd come for the Life Weaver, legends whispered. The first in 3 centuries, come to honor the one who'd saved their king and awakened ancient magic. Lysandra walked down an aisle of winter roses and ice crystals, her hand in Cassian's. The boy wore formal robes of deep blue, his dark hair brushed neat, looking every inch the young prince. But his grip on her hand was tight, his amber eyes serious. "You look really pretty, Mama," he whispered. The words settled into her heart like coming home. Theron waited at the altar, magnificent in ceremonial armor etched with moon phases, his scarred face open with emotion that took her breath away. When their eyes met, the mate bond sang between them, golden and absolutely right. The ceremony elder began the ancient words, speaking of bonds and choices, of fate's design and free will's power. But Lysandra barely heard them. She was lost in Theron's gaze, in the rightness of this moment, in the knowledge that she'd found where she belonged. When the elder nodded, Theron stepped forward, his hand cradling her face with devastating gentleness. "I claim you as my mate, my Luna, my heart," his voice carried across the silent crowd. "Not because fate demanded it, but because you taught me that second chance are sacred gifts, that broken doesn't mean finished, that love can grow from the ashes of loss." He lowered his head to her neck, and Lysandra felt his canines extend. The marking was fire and ice, agony and ecstasy, everything and nothing. All at once, the true mate bond snapped into place with the force of thunder, building on the Trinity connection they'd forged the night before. Theron's alpha strength, her life weaver magic, Cassian's awakening gift, all merging into something entirely new. Power surged through her, amplifying everything. The broken bond scar on her heart didn't vanish like she'd expected. Instead, it transformed. Where Dorian's rejection had left jagged pain, the Trinity bond wove 3 interlocking circles, a mark that incorporated the old wound into something beautiful, proof that even scars could become part of new wholeness. The crowd erupted in cheers as Theron lifted his head, his eyes glowing with alpha power and mate bond satisfaction. "My Luna Queen," he said simply. And Lysandra, who'd believed herself worthless and cursed, smiled through happy tears. "My king." The celebration lasted until dawn, but Lysandra barely remembered it. She was wrapped in Theron's arms, Cassian dancing around them with joy, surrounded by people who'd become family in the strangest, most beautiful way. Dorian approached near the end, his expression tentative. "I'm glad you found happiness," he said quietly. "You deserve better than I gave you." Lysandra looked at him, at the man who'd broken her and inadvertently led her here. "Thank you," she said, "for the rejection, for the pain, because without it, I never would have been in those caves, never would have found them." Understanding crossed Dorian's face, followed by something like relief. "Then maybe I did one thing right." He bowed and walked away, and Lysandra felt the last chains of bitterness fall away. She was free. Finally, completely free. 5 years passed like a dream made real. The palace that had once felt too grand for a rejected Omega became home. The rooms that had intimidated her became familiar. The halls that had echoed with loneliness filled with laughter and life. Lysandra stood in what had once been the formal ballroom, now transformed into a teaching space. 8 students sat in a circle around her, their hands glowing with tentative, life-weaver light as they practiced basic healing on injured plants. The gift had begun manifesting in others across the territories after the Trinity Bond, as if the ancient magic, dormant for 3 centuries, had been waiting for the right catalyst to awaken. Young wolves discovered healing abilities they'd never known. Old powers stirred, and Lysandra taught them all, passing on her grandmother's wisdom and adding her own hard-won knowledge. Through the windows, she could see the memorial garden Theron had commissioned. The Isolde Healing Center, a place where anyone could receive medical care regardless of rank or wealth, built in honor of a queen who died too young, staffed by life weavers who ensured no one else would suffer from lack of treatment. Footsteps approached, familiar and beloved. Cassian appeared in the doorway, 10 years old now and growing tall. His dark hair was wild despite someone's recent attempt to comb it, his amber eyes bright with excitement. "Mama, Papa says the delegation from the Eastern Territories just arrived. They brought the kids from the orphanage to visit." Lysandra smiled, dismissing her students for a break. The Rejection Sanctuary had been Theron's other major project, a network of safe houses across the territories for wolves who'd been cast out, rejected, or abandoned. Places where they could heal, learn skills, find new purpose. Because Theron understood, as Lysandra did, that no one should have to believe they were worthless. She walked with Cassian through corridors she'd once feared to touch, past tapestries she'd helped choose, toward the courtyard where Theron waited. Her mate stood in full morning sunlight, his scarred face relaxed in genuine happiness as he spoke with the visiting children. He'd aged well in 5 years, silver threading more heavily through his black hair, new laugh lines around his eyes. When he saw her, his expression transformed with love, so pure it still made her breath catch. "There she is," he said softly as she approached. "My heart." The Trinity mark on her chest pulsed with warmth, the 3 interlocking circles glowing faintly beneath her gown. Theron bore the same mark, Cassian too, visible proof of their unbreakable connection. Cassian tugged at her hand. "Mama, tell them about the day you saved Papa." The visiting children gathered closer, eager for the story they'd heard versions of, but never from the source. Lysandra settled on a garden bench, Cassian curled against her side, Theron's hand warm on her shoulder, and began. "5 years ago, I was wandering the Frostlands, broken and alone, believing I was worthless. My mate had rejected me, told me I was cursed, and cast me out." The children's eyes went wide with sympathy. "I was ready to die," she continued quietly. "Had accepted that my life didn't matter. Then I heard a sound in the darkness. A wolf dying from poison and wounds, lying in a frozen cave with no hope of survival." "What did you do?" a small girl whispered. "I made a choice. I decided that even if my life didn't matter to anyone else, I could use it to save someone who did matter. So I gave him everything I had, all my strength, all my power, all my life force." "And you nearly died," Cassian added, his voice filled with remembered fear. "I did nearly die, and when I woke up, I discovered that the stranger I'd saved was the Alphaking, and that somehow, impossibly, we were true mates." She looked up at Theron, who gazed down at her with infinite tenderness. "I thought dying to save someone would finally prove I mattered," Lysandra said softly. "But what I learned is that I always mattered. Being rejected wasn't the moon goddess making a mistake. It was her redirecting me to where I was always meant to be." She touched her chest, where the Trinity mark pulsed with gentle light. "The bond I lost was never meant to last. It was just the path that led me to find my real family. The king who needed healing, the boy who needed a mother, and the life I was meant to live." The children absorbed this, hope blooming on faces that had known too much rejection themselves. "So when people tell you you're broken," Lysandra continued, "remember that broken doesn't mean finished. Sometimes it just means you're being remade into something stronger, something better, something exactly what you're meant to be." Cassian squeezed her hand. Theron pressed a kiss to her temple, and Lysandra, the rejected Omega who became Luna Queen, smiled at the children before her and saw her own journey reflected in their eyes. Later that evening, after the visitors had left and Cassian had been tucked into bed, Lysandra stood in the courtyard where they'd held the mating ceremony 5 years ago. The aurora still danced overhead, eternal and beautiful. Theron joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair. Lysandra leaned into his embrace, feeling the Trinity bond hum contentedly between them. Cassian's sleeping presence, a warm glow in the back of her mind. More than I ever dreamed possible, she whispered. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the northern lights painted the sky in ribbons of color, three souls bound by love and sacrifice rested in the peace they'd fought so hard to claim. The broken healer had become a queen. The lost king had found his heart. The silent child had found his voice. And together they'd proven that second chances were the most sacred gifts of all. Years later, a statue was unveiled in the palace courtyard. Silver stone carved into the image of a woman with flowing hair, holding a small boy in her arms, both figures glowing with captured light. The inscription read, Lysandra Sylvain Nightshade, the broken healer who became queen. Proof that rejection is redirection, that scars become strength, that love finds a way always, and in the frost gardens, where winter roses bloomed eternal, the Trinity bond shone like a beacon, a testament to the family forged in sacrifice and sealed in love. Forever.